next item is Gulf of Mexico Coastal Acidification Network Stakeholder Feedback Project, and it's going to be presented by Dr. Janet Reimer, College of Earth, Ocean and Environmental, College of Earth, Ocean and the Environment at the University of Delaware. The purpose of this presentation is to inform non-acidification experts and concerned stakeholders on the basic knowledge of ocean acidification in the Southeast USA and Gulf of Mexico regions. This presentation also intends to conduct a post-presentation survey, assessing members on their understanding of acidification, its impacts, future implications. CCMP connection relates to water quality improvement priority actions 1.4 to identify, study and monitor new emerging pollutants of concern and their potential sources. And with that, over to you, Reimer.
Good morning. Thank you all for having us. You can all hear me, right? Great. Okay, just checking. So yes, I'm here representing this morning a project by the Gulf of Mexico Coastal Acidification Network and the Southeast Coastal Acidification Network. My colleagues Jennifer Vreeland and Kimberly Yates from GCAN, or the Gulf of Mexico Coastal Acidification Network, are also joining me this morning, but I will be giving the presentation on behalf of our joint project. Our work is primarily funded through NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program, and we are housed fiscally through the Regional Integrated Ocean Observing Systems networks in the Southeast through SOCORA and GCUS in the Gulf of Mexico. Next slide, please. So this morning, I'm going to start off giving a brief primer on ocean and coastal acidification, then give you a little bit of background on who we are and what we do, maybe most importantly, how this project came about, then go into a little bit of general state of knowledge of acidification in both of our regions in the Southeast and Gulf of Mexico. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a national effort to determine acidification vulnerabilities, which is the reason that we're here today. And then we're looking for feedback from you, our stakeholders, and this will be a Mentimeter response from you, the audience, and it's going to contribute to our overall project results, which we'll be publishing in mid to late 2023. So we'll obviously be back in touch to give you the results. Next slide, please. So the first thing we need to understand is, what is acidification? Acidification is a chemical or water quality problem. It is generally referred to as an increase in CO2 that causes a decrease in pH that is harmful to biota. And it's also important to remember that not all low pH conditions are necessarily considered harmful to individual organisms. We can make these high quality pH measurements of free-floating hydrogen atoms in water using a number of different methodologies. On fixed platforms or cruises. We can also take samples at different site locations. Specifically, we can also measure pH and its biogeochemical parameters that give us an understanding of what drives the pH. These parameters include alkalinity, or the base properties of water, total dissolved inorganic carbon species, of which there are several, and we can also directly measure dissolved carbon dioxide in the water. Another thing that's really important to remember is that when we talk about pH in seawater and we say normal pH, we're looking at a pH of around 8.1. However, since pH is measured and does occur on a logarithmic scale, even very small changes, such as like a 0.1 pH unit gain, can be important to organisms. Next slide, please. So when we say ocean acidification, we mean acidification specifically due to carbon dioxide from fossil fuel burning that dissolves directly into the surface of the ocean. And we're generally referring to the open ocean and continental shelf, not the continental shelf or in the coastal zone. In the graph on the left, we can see that since the Industrial Revolution, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been increasing by an average of about 2 parts per million per year. And the global surface ocean is keeping track with that increase in many areas. On the right, we can see that as CO2 dissolves into the surface ocean, it reacts directly with seawater or any fresh water that would be near a coastal area, and reacts to ultimately form an acid and those free hydrogen atoms that we can measure. Acidification can cause a pH decrease, meaning that seawater becomes more acidic. It can also cause an excess of CO2 that affects the types of carbon species in seawater that plants and animals can use to grow. But generally speaking, acidification itself affects species, habitats, and ecosystems. On the bottom here, you can see the results of an experiment where small marine snails were exposed to high CO2 or low pH conditions over the course of 45 days. By day 45 on the far right, you can see that the shell is actually dissolving. Next slide, please. When we talk about coastal acidification, we're not only referring to acidification due to the absorption of atmospheric CO2, but we're also referring to these local and regional processes, which can vary greatly from region to region. So some of these processes include eutrophication, which is the excess nutrient input that causes increased algae, phytoplankton, and plant blooms. When these plant cells die or phytoplankton die and decay after the bloom, they can release CO2, which directly impacts the pH in very localized spatial scales. We also have upwelling and transport of acidified water. So the upwelling can come from the deep ocean, and transport can just be simple lateral transport of more acidic waters onto the continental shelf and up into the coastal zone. Freshwater inflows in the coastal zone deliver lower pH water that is essentially higher in CO2. Since runoff is freshwater as well, and most types of runoff can also contribute to lower pH conditions. Septic leaching can supply water that is either directly high in CO2, or it can also provide those nutrients that cause eutrophication. Point sources are another source of either high CO2 or nutrients for eutrophication. However, we want to make this very clear that with adequate resource management, we can mitigate this decreasing pH. So if we can control point source output, regulate fertilizers, and manage stormwaters, we can mitigate acidification and the negative impacts to the environment. A good example of this is actually what occurred in Tampa Bay in the late 80s. Once eutrophication was kind of controlled, acidification also started to decrease. Or, well, I should say the effects of acidification started to decrease. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that we've kind of gotten a little bit of a primer on what acidification is, you're probably wondering who we are and why we are interested in collecting this data. So there are 6 different coastal acidification networks, or CANs, across the United States. Specifically, SOCAN region is from North Carolina to about, well, so Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, down to around the west coast of Florida. And then we overlap the west coast of Florida with GCAN, and their community extends all the way into Mexico and Cuba. So our executive teams, which for SOCAN is myself and Emily Hall, who's not able to be here today, and GCAN, which is Kim Yates and Jen Vreeland, who are here. We also are governed by a science working group and a stakeholder working group. And we're fortunate enough that Jennifer Hecker from CHNEP is part of our working group, and she's also part of this project in an advisory capacity. So we're very thankful to have CHNEP participating. Our working groups are generally made up of researchers, resource managers, communication specialists, educators, industry representatives, and concerned citizens. Our collective mission across the CANs is to work directly with scientists, resource managers, data end users, educators, and policymakers to synthesize and communicate the state of ocean acidification science and meet regional community needs. Regional community needs vary from region to region, so we all tend to work together as much as we can. Next slide, please. So a little bit on how this project came about. So in the United States, the Interagency Working Group on Ocean Acidification, which is made up of pretty much every federal agency, was formed in 2009 as part of federal legislation. Then in March of 2021, as part of a second federal act, the IWGOA started working on a national economic and environmental vulnerability assessment, which directly requested input from the CANs. The vulnerability assessment also requires input from stakeholders like you, which as we initially did through workshops directed towards our general membership. However, to expand the feedback that we had already gotten, SOCAN and GCAN, with the assistance of CHNEP, decided to submit a funding proposal to the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program. We were awarded the funds to develop and implement a stakeholder feedback questionnaire based on the methodology that was modeled after the CHNEP CCMP Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment and input from CHNEP staff and committees. We've actually, since we've submitted the proposal, have been able to extend our commitment and our reach to several other NEPs that we will be meeting with later this month and into early February. Next slide. So the goal of this project is to gauge stakeholder perception of acidification, identify locations where acidification monitoring is needed, and provide information on stakeholders' monitoring priorities to policymakers and government funding agencies, with the aim to identify acidification monitoring and knowledge gaps, which are important to stakeholders, and to inform the next IWGOA report to the White House on priority monitoring needs. Next slide, please. So the same legislation that directed the IWGOA to write the Ocean Acidification Vulnerability Assessment also called for a follow-up monitoring prioritization plan, which is based on the information gathered in the vulnerability report. But not only is it based on information gathered, it's also based on our knowledge gaps that we've identified in the vulnerability report. So the vulnerability report will allow us to update priority monitoring sites nationwide. As you can see from our map over here, SOCAN in 2017 decided on some monitoring priorities across the Southeast. However, it's been 5 years and these sites need to be updated, and some of them have actually been funded already. So based on the monitoring prioritization plan, the government hopes to be able to deploy new monitoring, and that'll be based on research needs and data gaps identified throughout this several-year process. And ultimately, it will be used to inform policymakers. So we're thinking 5 years down the line. Next slide, please. So briefly, we want to give you a little bit of information on the state of acidification knowledge across our regions. So long-term Gulf-wide monitoring is still too young to give us information on decadal trends as we have for the atmosphere and for the open ocean, but we do have some knowledge of some of the potential unknown drivers and the known drivers that affect acidification across the region. So down at the bottom, kind of in the middle and to the right of the screen, we're looking at the different drivers that have been identified across the Gulf of Mexico. So for basin-wide drivers, we know that ocean warming, air-sea CO2 exchange, and circulation can contribute to decreases in pH, which is an increase in acidification. Then locally speaking, you have riverine influx, which is that freshwater component, episodic storm events, eutrophication and hypoxia. Eutrophication because of the decay of the organic matter, and hypoxia is the consumption of oxygen by bacteria as they're decaying the organic matter. It has been used kind of as a as a co-stressor and as a way to identify where acidification may be occurring. And it's directly related to harmful algal blooms. We also have submarine groundwater discharge from the limestone aquifers along the Gulf of Mexico, because it's that freshwater inflow. And then some of the drivers that we know exist but don't yet understand how they affect acidification are coastal inundations and oil seeps and spills. We also know that in general, the main cause of acidification, which is increased carbon dioxide in the water, is increasing throughout the Gulf of Mexico. And we also know that low pH occurs following during these hypoxic events. So that's another reason why we're keeping a lookout for low oxygen. Next slide, please. We also have developed models to estimate Gulf-wide pH. And we know that pH is variable across the Gulf, and it can range from 8.04 to 8.12. And keeping in mind that 0.1 or 0.01 pH change can be meaningful. Also, pH can be variable on spatial scales as small as across bays and estuaries. For example, there can be differences between pH in seagrass beds and at the mouth of an estuary where fresh water enters. Next slide, please. So a South Atlantic Bight shelf-wide synthesis of carbon dioxide was assessed from 1991 through 2016 in the coastal zone, which is that red area in the map on the left, along the inner shelf, along the middle shelf, and along the outer shelf of the South Atlantic Bight. pH, well, CO2, let's start with CO2 because it's the cause of pH. CO2 across the shelf is increasing, but at variable rates. So the red and green dots and line in the top graph, the CO2 is increasing, and it's increasing more rapidly than CO2 on the outer and middle shelves. Consequently, we found that pH is decreasing faster in the inner shelf and coastal zone regions than it is on the outer shelf and middle shelf. Next slide, please. Okay, so now given the state of acidification, the next question is how does acidification impact our natural resources, and how are communities going to deal with this vulnerability? So first, the IWGOA defines vulnerability as an organism's, systems, or human's exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity to an environmental or anthropogenic stressor. The goal of the report is to determine which ecosystems, species, and social communities are vulnerable to acidification. The vulnerability assessment will help identify where monitoring and research need to be prioritized based on three main characteristics. So the exposure, which is impacts to marine ecosystems and resources, which is dependent on local ecosystem vulnerability to acidification. The social vulnerability, or the dependence of social and economic systems on marine resources that are vulnerable to acidification. And the biological response, which is the impact of ocean acidification on species, habitats, and ecosystems. And all of these have direct impacts on our coastal communities. Next slide, please. So in general, we want to know what the current and future levels of acidification are in our regions. So I'm going to take you through this slowly, a little bit at a time, because there is a lot here. So we have several long-term monitoring sites, which are those red stars in both the maps of the Gulf of Mexico and the Southeast. There are many more than this, but these are the ones right now that SOCAN and GCAN are directly working with. So we know that acidification is increasing in the upper Florida Keys at Chica Rocks, all across the South Atlantic Bight Shelf, and several NEPs in the region have also reported decreasing pH over time. We also know that calcium carbonate formation of reefs throughout the Keys is decreasing, and some areas are already experiencing dissolution of the calcium carbonate substrate. We also know that low pH conditions accompany hypoxic events along the South Carolina coast, within Tampa Bay, in the Mississippi River plume, along flower garden banks, and in the northern Gulf of Mexico. So when we take a look at this map of the Gulf of Mexico, all of those lines going back and forth and the dots are different long-term, or I should say repeat cruise transects and repeat stations. We don't really have long-term on decadal scales yet. Then over in the southeast, the next little map is a map of the East Coast ocean acidification cruises, which have been occurring approximately every 3 years since 2015. Those are also repeat sites, and we do have some information that does indicate that pH is decreasing within that South Atlantic Bight area as well. And then finally, our map over here of the SOCAN region identifies sites that we have, the red stars. The yellow circled sites are sites where monitoring is about to begin down in the Florida Keys, and where we've had a project going now for almost a year up in South Carolina. So we were fortunate enough to have those sites funded. And then the rest of the numbered sites are where back in 2017, SOCAN membership essentially discussed and decided that those should be priority monitoring sites within the Southeast. So you can see that there's a lot of monitoring going on, but the long-term data really isn't there yet to help us understand what our future acidification levels look like. Next slide, please. So when we want to try to understand the biological response, and it's that sensitivity and adaptive capability of organisms and ecosystems to acidification, the first thing we need to understand is which species are being impacted. So in the Gulf of Mexico, which is the green diagram, and the southeast, which is the blue, we have 3 general classifications for species. We have economically important species, species that have been studied, whether in the lab or through wild assessments, and species that we know have been impacted by acidification in the wild. As you can see, we have very little overlap of these 3 important classifications. Specifically, the yellow circle in the middle is calling your attention to where all 3 of them overlap. And in both regions, we don't have any. We do know that we do have this extensive list for both regions of species that we consider economically important. But again, the studies on these species just haven't occurred. Next slide, please. In 2019, there was almost 200,000 jobs, and that's that first blue and green box on the bottom, that depended on commercial and recreational fishing in both the Gulf of Mexico and Southeast. In our second set of boxes, those 200,000 jobs accounted for over $7 million of employment wages and gross sales of over $32 billion in each region. This is just for fishing. It doesn't account for other recreational activities or the intrinsic value of ecosystems or the services they provide. Local economies stand to be impacted by losses in the fishing industry. We just really don't know how much yet. There are many gaps in our knowledge, which we understand because we can take a look back at the graph before, and we know that these studies just haven't occurred. We also know that there are a lot of gaps in our knowledge because we don't have monitoring sites at very small spatial scales yet. So we're asking you, our stakeholders, to help us figure out where and how to prioritize funding to help fill those knowledge and social gaps. And then we have now some time to take a few questions if there's any clarification that needs to be done, and then we'll have the Mentimeter questions for you.
Any questions in the room?
I have one. I I don't know if you can hear me. But I have one question for you regarding your social vulnerability graphic. The economic models or economic data you use to determine that vulnerability, is there a standardized resource or more treatment reason-wide that you can use for that evaluation?
I think the question was, I think I got most of it. For the social vulnerability, can whoever's controlling the slides, can you go back to that graphic just to make sure that I'm understanding the question correctly? You're asking if there's a resource for this information?
Yes.
Yes. So down at the bottom, there is a link, and it's for NOAA fisheries. This information is also provided in the executive summaries of the National Vulnerability Report, which I believe we sent along to Jennifer and Nicole prior to the meeting. The vulnerability report itself is still under review to go to the White House, but our executive summary is available, and it's also available through our website. That website, I can, Kim or Jen, could you drop it in the chat, please? The project site.
I dropped the links directly to the executive summaries in the chat for you, Janet.
Awesome, thank you so much. So those are available to you. Because this is such a short presentation, we didn't have time to, pull all the details. So please, the executive summaries are only 2 pages long. So hopefully those will supplement this information.
And for those of you in the room, you do have copies of that in your packet, both the GCAM. Thank you.
I saw a question online.
No, it says we can hear the presenter fine. We were just checking to make sure the background noise wasn't interfering. They're having.
Is it one further up?
That was me.
Oh, there you go. Oh, that's the link. Okay. All right.
I would able the noise canceling headphones probably coming. If you have a question and don't hesitate to raise your hand or drop something in chat or even unmute.
All right. So I think we are good for questions. I believe we have some Mentimeter activities to go on to.
Yes. Am I sharing my screen for that, or you have it?
We will share our screen, and I apologize for any delay. It seems to, the screen takes a few minutes to update, but we'll share it from our screen.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I guess I can either.
Well, I was going to say, while we're waiting for a minute, if everybody who is not familiar with Mentimeter would take their phone out or open a different browser tab if you're on a computer. Because in a minute here, we're going to give you instructions up there right here at the top. Go to menti.com and then you'll enter that code. All right, we can see the Mentimeter, so just everyone's logging in, and when you're ready, feel free to take it away.
Great. I just want to give a little kind of information here that the point of this feedback is to understand what you understand about acidification. So I'm not going to give you any additional information. Hopefully, and if you don't have any knowledge or don't remember anything from the presentation, we want to know that too. So don't be afraid to, either say, for example, on this first one, it's, do you have any knowledge of this topic prior today? If so, how would you classify your level of knowledge on ocean acidification? Please feel free to say none.
Let me know when you want me to show the results. It says results are hidden right now. Okay. We have 11 respondents.
I guess we don't want to. kind of bias any answers. So, I don't know.
Come in. So why don't we give it another minute? I don't think everyone knew. If you could go ahead and enter your response now so that we can see how many people are online and in the room who are gonna participate.
What's the code, Jennifer?
It is 5390. So let's give it another minute. It's still rising.
Yeah.
It's definitely more of a dull thumping. I still put on noise canceling headphones. So have them over here. So it's loud in my own.
All right, has everyone had a chance to respond that wants to? Raise hand or speak up now if you haven't. All right, it looks like we have all the respondents, round 26 is what we'll be aiming for in each.
Wow, that's encouraging. So I guess after we show the results, we can just get right into the next question. How would you describe your main source for information about acidification? So where did you learn about acidification? School, social media, print media, a public institution, or some other place?
All right, we're now at 26.
Okay. Oh, wow. Looks like we really need to step up our social media game. Great. Awesome. Let's go on to the next one. Which of the following processes are you familiar with? Please go ahead and check all the processes that apply. Cool. All right. Next. So of those processes, which do you think could lead to or worsen acidification? Great. Next.
Wait,
Oh,
I got a
sure.
So that's the assessment of the knowledge here, but what is the answer?
Ah. Well, yes. It's regional. So if we're thinking about Charlotte Harbor, probably less likely to be fossil fuel burning, but more likely to be, because it's an estuary, freshwater inflows, nutrient contamination. But maybe, hey, nutrient contamination, maybe we can decrease that. Erosion and runoff, most certainly, and any area that has a large percentage of impervious surfaces, that stormwater runoff is certainly going to be a big deal. But again, that is something that we can manage. So there was a stormwater runoff discussion right before this acidification discussion. So a good tie-in. And there is no one answer. I mean, it's.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for asking. Next. If you're concerned about the effects of acidification on the environment, please check the ecosystem you believe is of most concern to you. So just one answer here. Okay.
Yeah.
Next, please. Are you aware of the potential effects of coastal or ocean acidification on marine animals? Next. Of the marine animals that may be affected by acidification, which are you most concerned about? So this is a small subset of those species on the Venn diagrams. Interesting. All right, we can go on to the next one. Do you fish for either finfish or shellfish, or both? Wow. All right, next. If you fish, could you please specify if you fish recreationally or commercially? So if you were one of the 35% that didn't fish, don't answer this question. I think we're probably at the max there. Awesome. Thank you. So we have no recreation, we have no commercial fishermen in this group. It's cool. All right. If yes, so if you are a fisher person, please specify which zone best describes your fishing grounds. Do you fish offshore, in nearshore or coastal waters, inshore, which would be bays, estuaries, or inshore tidal flats or marshes? Great. Next, please. If these ecosystems are affected by acidification, which in your opinion is the most important to focus research and monitoring and education on? So these are the same as the previous slide. So it's offshore, nearshore, coastal waters, or inshore bays and estuaries, or inshore tidal flats and marshes. And if there's another area where you fish, say other, or that you think is important. Great. And sorry for those of you who don't have any questions to answer right now. Great, I think we could move on to the next one. What best describes the top 3 species you fish for or consume at home? So either maybe it's, you dig for oysters or eat tuna at home. This one is a writing question, so you can just you should be able to type your answer.
Are you looking for the 3 species or words that describe the species?
That's a good question. I guess if, you eat clams, oysters, mussels, you could just write shellfish. And you don't have to have 3. I mean, you may only eat lobster.
Okay.
And I'll also say that you guys are our guinea pigs. You're the first group that has taken this survey. So we're taking notes on how the questions are worded and asked. Ooh. It's very interesting. Kim, can you make a note that we should probably also
Already got it.
specify, local versus not local, because
Yep.
I live in the Northeast and my salmon's not not local either. Excellent. Great. Thank you all. Let's go on to the next. What recreational marine activities do you take part in? For this one, please feel free to give more than one answer. Do you scuba dive or snorkel? And if it's both, great. Sailing, boating, fishing, shellfish digging. Do you just like to go to the beach? Do you just like to kayak or paddleboard or some kind of other, maybe canoeing? Or do you really not take part in any marine activities, which would be none?
Just note, this question is set up to only allow one response.
Oh, is it?
So people, whatever the last thing they click on, if they click multiple, will be their answer.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. We'll work on it for next time.
No problem.
Great. Oh. Maybe one or two more? Or 24? Okay, we can go on to the next. Are you concerned that acidification may affect your employment in the future? So maybe that's your wages, or maybe are you even concerned that you will have a job? Or maybe we just put that idea into your head and have to reword the question. Sorry.
It's job security. Yeah. No.
I guess there might be an argument for saying, well, if we control acidification, maybe the cans won't have a job in the future. Double-edged sword, right? Okay, we can go on to the next question. Of the following locations that could be affected by acidification, could you please rank your concern about the potential effects of acidification? So in this case, if you strongly disagree, it means that you're really not concerned. And if you strongly agree, it means you're very concerned. I guess if you're not concerned at all, we should also state that that's an option. I think we should get on to the next one. These should start to go a little quicker now because they're all kind of based on the same thought process. So based on your current knowledge of the ongoing research and acidification throughout the Gulf of Mexico and Southeast US, we would just like to go through and rank the following research areas. We initially had it on a scale of high, medium, or low priority for focus in the immediate future. But because of the way that Mentimeter is set up, we have it as a strongly disagree or strongly agree. So that strongly agree is going to be your high priority, and the disagree is going to be a low priority for the following different areas of research. So, next slide, please. So basically, are you concerned about impacts to fisheries? Do you have low concern, medium concern, or high concern?
So you're supposed to slide one of the bars?
For the future, this one allows you to select a scale for all three, low, medium, and high.
Oh,
So I think we'll restructure this for the next committee, but yes, people should only select one. And just scroll the level of concern on the one they select.
thank you, Jennifer. It's my first time using Menti.
Janet,
Definitely-
this is Kim. I'm making notes on all of the edits we need to make to slides, and thanks so much to everyone for your patience as we're learning how to do this.
Oh, it's great. It's a lot of fun. Just
So are you concerned about impacts to different habitats? Maybe I should say various habitats, not just like, hey, are you concerned about mangroves? Well, if you're concerned about mangroves, great. That is a habitat. Or maybe if you're concerned about multiple habitats. This is a very vague question. We could go on to the next. I'm trying to kind of keep us moving here. Are you concerned about impacts from extreme events? These could be weather events such as hurricanes, floods, droughts, or harmful algal blooms, or I think that pretty much covers it.
you mean specifically impacts with regards to contributing to acidification?
Yes.
Okay, so not just generally impacts.
Yeah,
But
correct.
specific, okay, got it.
Yes. Everything is specific to acidification. I think we can move on. Are you concerned about the rate at which acidification is occurring? Let's see the results on this one. Awesome. Great. Can we go on to the next, please? Are you concerned about determining where specifically acidification is occurring on small scales? Kind of, if you think about it, maybe in your neck of the woods, we could say. All right, I think. Great. Next, please. We're almost done. Thank you all for participating. This is really great. Are you concerned about impacts to the economy, which would include recreational use of marine resources, tourism, restaurants, food resources, and consumer businesses? So do you think that acidification will in fact impact our regional and local economies? Okay. Next, please. Do you think that it is important to understand how acidification impacts different aquaculture, whether it's finfish or shellfish hatcheries, maybe wild, basic aquaculture, not aquaculture meaning like farm raised, not wild habitat. All right. On to the next. Thank you. Do you think that we should be prioritizing technology development for monitoring acidification? So that would mean pH measurements or the alkalinity, the seawater bases, carbon dioxide directly, or dissolved inorganic carbon species. Basically, any type of acidification measurement. Great. Are you concerned about other environmental impacts worsening acidification? So another environmental impact being any type of climate change, that would be ocean warming or hurricanes, harmful algal blooms, floods, droughts. Alrighty. Next. Do you think it's important to prioritize and study ways to reduce the effects of acidification? Okay. Next, please. If you take a second, please, to think about if there are any research priorities that we did not mention, you can type it here. All right, I think it looks like we may have hit everything that can be thought of. Next. Oh, we did get one. Ooh, now we have 3. Oh, wow, 4. So I'll just say that we have a couple of questions for you on communication. So maybe that will address the education need here. Great. If we could get on to the next one, please. I promise there are just a few left. So now we're going to go into education priorities. Next. Which of the following educational opportunities do you believe we should target about ocean acidification? You should be able to pick 2 here. I'm sorry, the font's really small, but it's, do you think we should target K through 12 curriculum in schools, colleges and university curriculum, public interest groups or campaigns, tribal engagement, underrepresented groups, or policymakers? Oh, wow, guys, it looks like we have our work cut out for us. Great, thank you. Another one. Awesome. Are there any educational opportunities that you think we've missed? If there wasn't something on that previous slide, please go ahead and type it in for us here. And then I think we only have 1 or 2 more. Great, thank you. Oh, here we go now. Nice, public service announcements. Social media. I will say that SOCAN has a Twitter page and a Facebook page. So for Facebook, it's our name spelled out. It's Southeast Ocean and Coastal Acidification Network. And this is our last one. I think we want to understand communication priorities, which is that informal education. So I think you all, many of you just told us a little bit about that. But what types of communication would be helpful for conveying information about acidification? So on the last slide, we just saw interest in social media, public zoos and aquariums. So I think that maybe it's the wording of our slides. We can improve that for our next go round, which I believe is to your Citizens Advisory Committee in 2 weeks. That's great. Thank you. I think that's the last one, but just double check. It might be one more. No, that's it. Thank you all so much for participating today. We really appreciate it, and your feedback is wonderful. We will get back to you next year when the project wraps up with all of our results. In the meantime, please, you can follow our results on our project website, which is accessible through the SOCAN webpage. I'll make sure to drop it in the chat before I drop off today. And I think I did include it in the packet that we sent. But once again, thank you so much for having us. And thank you to Jennifer Hecker, who has been a great advisor through all of this. And we'll happy to continue working with Jennifer and CHNEP through the next year. Thanks again.
In the room, there are some sandwiches that come out. We are running a bit behind time, so help yourself to a sandwich and bring it back. Yeah, eat while we're having a discussion. That for that last item, that was for information only, so no action item.